Christopher Drake was the first Western practitioner to receive diploma accreditation from Professor Buteyko, whilst under the supervision of his teacher, Alexander Stalamansky. In 1991, he co-founded the first authorised Butekyo clinic in the West, in Sydney, Australia, and participated in the first published medical trials. He introduced the method to the UK in 1996, where his results attracted major publicity. He has taught over 20,000 students in Australia, the UK, USA, Europe and Asia. In January 2013, Christopher launched the Learn Butekyo method online service to promote and offer the classical Butekyo method to students all over the world. Christopher teaches advanced training online and takes a special interest in serious cases. He divides his time between Europe and Asia. Christopher, welcome along to the programme Surviving 2020.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be here.
We're going to be discussing the Butekyo method, which you are a senior practitioner in the field. Could you briefly explain a little about the Butekyo method to begin?
Well, the Butekyo method was developed by a Russian medical scientist by the name of Konstantin Pavlovich Buteyko. And he did research on, well, basically the cause of chronic disease. He based a theory on the work of Spallanzani, Zuntz, Bohr, Da Costa, some of the great founding fathers of medicine, and came to the conclusion that it was a deficiency of CO2 in the body, and he developed a breathing method. The breathing method is based on bringing the respiratory rate, or the rate of breathing, to its physiological norm. You've got a norm for blood pressure, norm for sugar level, norm for pulse, and so forth. And likewise, you have a norm for breathing. And what he found was that nobody who had the physiological norm for breathing had asthma, allergies, angina, bronchitis, bronchoectasis, cystic fibrosis, diabetes mellitus, emphysema, COPD, sleep apnea, hormonal disorders. None of these chronic diseases occurred in people which had a respiratory rate, i.e. litres per minute of breathing. And so he set about to develop a technique to retrain the breathing pattern. And his theory was that if he retrained the breathing pattern to its norm, then those diseases would reverse. He spent 8 years on the research, and basically he was successful. And for the last, well, nearly 28 or whatever years, I've been teaching his method. It became very well known for asthma, but it's just as effective for many other conditions, particularly breathing conditions, COPD, emphysema, asthma, as I said. And so I think I've treated around 25,000 students. We run a group of practitioners and we teach this method online these days, but in the early days we used to travel the world basically holding classes. It's had medical trials, it's had a fair amount of publicity over the course of its time in the West.
Could you give us one or two case studies related to the Butekyo method?
Let's say take asthma. Well, people take medications, symptomatic medications like Ventolin, they take preventers like Pulmicort, so forth, budesonide or whatever, and within a few days they're able to overcome their symptoms, their asthma attacks, and thus they don't require the Ventolin or the symptomatic relief medication, not because we tell them to stop taking it, but because if you don't have symptoms, you don't take symptomatic medication. And then as they make further progress over a sustained period, they no longer require the preventer medication, the steroid-based medication and so forth. That can take a week, 2 or 3 or whatever, and at which time they can present themselves to their doctors and report that they're not having any symptoms, they're not having any tight chest, shortness of breath, spasms or whatever, and they can be taken off their steroid medications. And I guess the number of cases for asthma would be, that I've worked with, would have to be in excess of 15,000 or so. And it's always much the same. If you're dealing with someone who's very, very serious, very severe, of course, it's not a simple 1 or 2 week job. It can take months even. And with deeper conditions, Crohn's disease, autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue, emphysema in which the bronchus is damaged and so forth, it can take much longer to get the sort of results. But what's interesting, and what happens all the time, virtually without exception, as soon as they start to practice and as soon as their breathing improves, to some linear degree, their symptoms reduce. So they become very encouraged, because it doesn't take long to say, well, I've got some improvement here. And I, for example, require less medication, which is a symptomatic medication I refer to. Your people with diabetes just require less insulin. People with COPD require less Spiriva or whatever bronchodilator they're taking. They get less breathless. People with asthma don't have so many spasms. Migraine headaches are either shorter in duration or less frequent, and that's pretty quick. You start to see positive results very quickly, but to sort of finish the job and so-called cure, that can take a much longer period of time, depending on the condition and their other health conditions and so many other factors.
I've read that the method is also used in conjunction with sport and yoga.
Yogic exercise would be Kumbhaka pranayama, which is breath holding exercises. And so, yes, there are a lot of similarities. There's a lot of yoga breathing which actually is not really suitable for those people who are sick. The objective of yoga presumably is to pierce the nature of reality. It's not just a health technique as such. It's actually it's to develop some skills to enable you to become more self-aware. There are health benefits and so forth, but there are some very great similarities with yoga, and all the yoga practitioners, the serious ones, find that their yoga exercises are that much easier to do. When they're practicing their asanas, they can hold them for much longer, much more, quite effortlessly. And so we have a lot of yoga people who are advocates of Buteyko method. But Buteyko method is directed specifically to normalize the rate of respiration and to reverse chronic diseases.
The statistics of out of 10 people, how many people actually do breathe correctly? This is a very interesting point also.
The diagnostic test that Buteyko developed was called the control pause. And if you can effortlessly, and I mean effortlessly, hold your breath for 50 to 60 seconds before you have the urge to breathe, that would correspond to the physiological norm, which is 3 to 4 liters a minute. If someone came to us and they had a control pause of between 50 and 60 seconds, we would say, there's nothing for you here. Your breathing is already, you are already at the point we aim to bring people to. So we can't offer you anything. When Buteyko made his discovery, the average control pause was around 30 seconds, 30 odd. And since that time, it's been falling. Now, the average control pause is 20 and below, and quite often, 10 seconds and so forth.
Sorry, did you say the average control pause is 30 seconds with most people?
It was when Professor Buteyko made his discovery. And rural people, robust Russian rural folk, had a control pause 35, on average in that region. And then when you moved into the cities, the more urbanized areas, more stress, more pollution, or whatever reasons you might like to theorize, the control pause would drop. When I began in the 90s, the average control pause in Australia was around 22, 23, and we would seldom meet somebody who, say, had a control pause of 15. Now it's quite commonplace. And of course, you must draw the parallel. If your control pause is 60 seconds, 50 to 60, it would mean you breathe 3 to 4 liters per minute at rest on average. If your control pause is 30 seconds, it would mean that you breathe twice. In other words, you breathe 6 to 8 liters per minute on average. If your control pause is around 20, it would mean you breathe 3 times above what is physiologically recommended. And obviously you get the mathematical drift now. If your control pause is 10 seconds, it would mean that you breathe 6 times more than what is recommended. The condition that Buteyko said that we treat actually is called CHVS, chronic hyperventilation syndrome, which is quite different from acute hyperventilation, which occurs in an instance, panic, trauma, or whatever. But chronic means it's something which is ongoing all the time. It's systemic, it's unnoticeable, it's persistent. And so because you breathe 20 to 30,000 times a day, it's the accumulative effects that cause the health problems, not the acute things which may occur from hyperventilating for 5 or 10 minutes or something like that.
With asthma, what is the breathing level with somebody who has an asthmatic condition, for example?
The severe asthmatics have control pause 10, 12, and so forth. The moderate asthmatics have control pause 20, like everybody else. You must realize that asthma is a defensive mechanism. Some people, no matter how they breathe, are not going to have asthma symptoms because they don't have that defensive mechanism. They might develop sleep apnea. They might develop diabetes. They may have weight gains. They may develop another defense or compensation mechanism. But for those people who are asthmatic, when their control pause gets under 30, depending on how strong that mechanism is, they will begin to have restriction to their breathing. They'll have constriction of the bronchus and spasms and so forth. And we'll take a method. As soon as you elevate the level of CO2, the bronchoconstrictions just come off as quickly as they came. One thing that should be of interest, perhaps, which is, I'm not saying that no one ever died of asthma, but there's no mention of a death for asthma in the medical literature until the introduction of bronchodilating medications.
You were also talking about PTSD, the treatment of PTSD also with this method.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I began, Professor Buteyko ordered us, just you treat asthma. Don't treat other diseases. You need to demonstrate the efficacy of my method to the medical community to see if it gains acceptance. So we did. But then all of a sudden, people with other conditions started coming because they were taking asthma medications, like people with emphysema and COPD, because they know that they take asthma medications. So the next thing you know, you've got someone in your class who doesn't have asthma, they have COPD. So I said, well, we don't really treat COPD. We spoke to Professor Buteyko. He said, yeah, this is how you treat chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is to treat, it's different approach. The same principle, of course, but the approach is a little different. And then came chronic fatigue. Well, that started because we had asthma patients who also had chronic fatigue, and they informed us that their chronic fatigue had improved. So I thought, oh, okay, so then we began obviously treating chronic fatigue. 20 years ago or more, chronic fatigue was a fake condition for malingerers. Nobody understood what it was. It was for lazy people. And so these poor people who suffered dreadfully weren't believed because there was no diagnosis. All they knew was they just felt awful and couldn't get up and move around and work as they wanted to. And so that's how we got involved with that, because they started, the ones with asthma, and then of course we made the connection, and Buteyko said, that's right, you should do it. Now PTSD started the same for me. I didn't promote Buteyko method for PTSD. I started meeting veterans. I think it was at the Hale Clinic, or could have been at the French Medical Centre when I worked in London. They didn't come for PTSD. They came because either they had chronic fatigue or they had asthma or whatever, and we do the same old Buteyko method, and then they would say, I'm feeling more calm, I can sleep, I can exist, I can function better. It wasn't usually a complete reversal. But once again, I spoke to Professor Buteyko about that and said, I said, PTSD, it's a joke. This person has been traumatized. That's all it is. They've been traumatized, except PTSD is a constant trauma, day after day. Mental torture, physical torture. But of course, with PTSD, it's usually reserved for the military because they haven't been traumatized for half an hour or, beaten up by someone. They've been traumatized for months at a time or even longer. And so the debilitation goes quite deeply. And so it started off just with these chaps who had asthma, they had chronic fatigue and so forth. And they reported back to me that I feel a bit more chilled out. I feel more relaxed. I don't have nightmares. I had my first good night's sleep, all this kind of thing. And so when I checked their control pause, it was low when they started. And when their control pause improved, their PTSD symptoms came off in a linear fashion.
Over the breathing control?
Control pause, that score, that breath holding score I told you about. Danny, you hold your breath effortlessly. So you make a breath in and a breath out and you hold. And if you can hold your breath after a breath out effortlessly for 35 or so seconds, then on average, you won't be having those symptoms.
This is a scientific and tested, researched analysis and facts of that within that field, that particular field.
We are sort of lumped into the alternative world, medical world, if you will. But Professor Buteyko was not. He was a medical scientist, and the whole method, the whole principle of the method is predicated on physiology, biology, biochemistry, and in fact, the whole method is written up in biochemical, with a full biochemical explanation. I'm not against alternative stuff, by the way. I mean, if it helps you, great, but this is not an alternative. This is mainline scientific principle, which has a biochemical explanation and is predicated on the laws of science. The Bohr effect, the rate at which oxygen is discharged from the hemoglobin, the role of CO2 on the organism, which is well documented and so forth in medical literature. It's all predicated on the work of Henderson, Sir Michael Foster of Cambridge, or his work on respiratory function, the work of hyperventilation by Da Costa. But when I speak to a physiologist or a medical biologist or whatever, there's never any argument, there's never any discussion about the authenticity of, at least in theory, the idea. In practice, it has to be seen to be before you know it's effective or not.
In the present times, anxiety and stress levels are increasing rapidly with this current crisis. What are your views on treating anxiety with the Buteyko method?
Well, Professor Buteyko actually did some serious work on this very subject, because stress and anxiety, it's well known in medical literature that all conditions are worse when a person is stressed, and yet the term seems so ambiguous. Everyone knows what you're talking about, but there's not a lot of very good understanding around the mechanism behind it. And this is why, and all Buteyko students know it. As soon as they start to practice, their pulse drops, their blood sugars normalize, their blood pressure becomes more normal, they feel more at ease. Even with kids and so forth, their cheeks become rosy, they can sit quietly and contented, they become less fidgety and so forth. They become more relaxed, yet still alert. So if we look at Buteyko's understanding or his explanation why this is, when a person is threatened, and we should really revert to ancient times to get an understanding of the mechanism, a physical threat, the brain is aware of a physical threat, a wild animal or some sort of people that want to kill you or whatever, and the organism discharges certain hormones. And these hormones enable you to, well, they give you virtual superhuman strength to run or to fight. And anyone who's been in a fight will know what they feel extremely energized. And anyone who comes under threat, the deepening, the breathing deepens, muscle tension is greatly enhanced, and physically they become much stronger. Well, that's all fine. That saves your life. That could save your life. So stress is not a bad thing if you are being challenged physically in that environment. These days, our lives are much more abstract. If the bank is going to foreclose on your home, or you might lose your job, it's quite a different thing than if you're being attacked by, a tiger or something like that. You haven't got so you're threatened on one hand. This discharges all these hormones. You develop muscle tension. You develop this enormous power. Blood pressure goes up. The rate at which the threshold of excitability of the nervous system is greatly enhanced and so forth. The problem is there's nothing for you physical to do to discharge these hormones. Consequently, they morph into quite a deadly poison. And this is why people get sick from stress, because they worry about things, they're very concerned about things, they feel threatened, the body discharges these hormones, and there's nothing physical to do. You can't fight with a bank manager or something, you have no outlet as such. And so what we found was with Buteyko method, and the reason why Buteyko claimed it worked, his theory to explain what we all see anecdotally is that when you increase the level of carbon dioxide, the rate at which oxygen comes off the hemoglobin is greatly enhanced. The threshold of excitability of the nervous system calms down, vessels dilate, and these poisons or these hormones, they weren't poisons when they started. It's just if they're not discharged properly physically, they become poisons. They become washed out from the organism. So we can't, of course, ameliorate the reason behind someone's stress or anxiety, but most definitely from a physical point of view, from a biochemical and physiological perspective, you can definitely use Buteyko method to ameliorate those symptoms and those reactions, which are basically hormonal. And so Buteyko method is a fantastic technique to ameliorate stress, particularly chronic stress,
which a lot of people are experiencing right now across the board. The threat of a virus coupled with the economic worries and anxieties. Therefore, you're saying that practicing Buteyko method on a daily basis can also help, and the stress hormones and poisons that are released will bring that down and remove that from the body.
You said it precisely, Daniel. I would only emphasize one point. As soon as you begin practicing It might take a day to get the hang of the exercises and to get going a little bit, and the results will come immediately. Immediately, you'll feel improvement. Immediately. I don't mean in 5 minutes. It might take a day or so of practicing, but you will notice a visceral difference. And then when you apply the Buteyko method, you'll notice results very quickly in terms of pulse coming off, blood pressure coming off, nervous system calming down. You'll be able to think a bit more clearly. And that's because the rate at which neurons synapse with brain cells is linear to the level of CO2. So once you improve CO2, you improve oxygenation, brain works a little better, nervous system calms down, and you can better handle the situation that you've got. Because at the end of the day, you can only do what you can do, and it becomes logical. And I've been dealing with so many people with implacable situations and terrible, terrible problems and worries. And it's interesting because they practice the Buteyko method, and I still feel for them. They've done a good job. They feel much better. But I take an interest, obviously, because you get to know people as you're working with them, and you say, how's it going with all that mess that you're trying to work your way through? And generally the view that they arrive at uniformly is, I'll do my best, and that'll just have to do. I can't do more than my best. So they become resigned on one side, but on the other side, they feel very much better and probably more capable to deal with what they've got to deal with.
And continuing with the present circumstances in this crisis, in your opinion, what's the best way or the way of treating patients with breathing difficulties with COVID-19?
Well, if they're in acute difficulty, obviously they should be, treated in a some sort of traditional way. And what I find really amazing is that people with COPD, people with asthma, people with bronchiectasis, people with very severe pneumonia and so forth, if they develop what's called a cytokine storm, which is a situation where the immune system reacts so strongly that it actually impairs the function of the respiratory system, they give them steroid. It's the most common treatment there is. Prednisone, prednisolone, Berlacort, Canacort, budesonide in pill form, injectable, via nebulizer. It is the bog standard treatment for anybody with inflammation in the respiratory system, the bronchus and the lungs. And I find it very curious, I find it bizarre that certain doctors in the United States, certain doctors in the UK are now saying, we've found something quite extraordinary, quite a breakthrough here. We can give people budesonide in a nebulizer and the people feel better within a very short space of time. That's what you do with all inflammations. That's the bog standard treatment. That is the normal, anybody who goes to hospital with pneumonia, COPD, they've got the flu and they've got COPD, they're distressed, there's massive inflammation, a cytokine storm develops, so the immune system not overreacts, but reacts so strongly that it actually impairs or causes the respiratory system to be dysfunctional, the people can't breathe. The normal treatment is to give them, I would guess, in any hospital in the UK, I'm going to guess 30 milligrams of prednisone. That's the cheapest, to take a few pills. Within 2 hours, they're sitting up in bed having a cup of tea. Because these are immunosuppressants, specific targeted immunosuppressants, and that cytokine storm will be taken off because they don't die from the damage done to the lungs or to the respiratory system by the virus. They die because of the cytokine storm, whereby the immune system overwhelms the function of the respiratory system. And the worst thing you could possibly do, the worst, if you wanted to do the person harm during a time when their respiratory system is having inflammation would be to put a tube down there and pump air into the system, because you're going to break blood vessels, you're going to cause tremendous damage. And as soon as I heard they were using ventilators, it was like, what? I was just amazed, because if you did this with any COPD patient, with any asthma patient, with anyone suffering pneumonia or a serious bout of flu, you'll kill them. And this is what's been happening in the United States and across the world. If you put 100 healthy people on these ventilators, 60 or 70 of them would die, and they're perfectly healthy. That would be my guess. That's how damaging these machines would be. It's a last, because normally you try prednisolone, injections of Canacort, the steroid to calm things down. If still you weren't getting enough traction, you'd use a cannula, which is just a little nose clip, which would feed more oxygen into the system. Fine. If that wasn't working, you might use a nebulizer and so forth, or something with slight partial air pressure. But to ram a tube down someone's throat into their bronchus when it's during a time of tremendous inflammation, I can't imagine. To me, my way of thinking, it's a death sentence.
The widespread treatment, in a sense, in some cases, with how advanced the disease is, it's incredibly tragic and sad that so many people have lost their lives to this wretched virus. What you have just said there is equally disturbing.
If you pump air into the lungs in such a way, like the way they do during intubation, because of the Bohr effect, and this is very important, you will never understand Buteyko method, or you will never understand the physiology of breathing and why it's helpful if you don't understand the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect was developed by Christian Bohr, and he worked out that the level of carbon dioxide determines how much oxygen is discharged from the hemoglobin into cells and tissue. So if there's a deficiency of carbon dioxide, the oxygen its affinity to the hemoglobin will grow too strong, and it won't be released, and you'll have oxygen deficiency. You've got the oxygen, it's just not getting out of the blood into the cells and tissue where it's needed. So I can't imagine a more effective way of disturbing the CO2-O2 balance in the lungs. I can't think of a more effective way to cause a deterioration in this what's called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. I can't think of a better way to do that than to shove a hose down someone's throat and to inflate the lungs with air which has only 0.039% of CO2 when the bronchus requires a level of 6.5 to 7%.
Yeah, on the subject of the breathing difficulties, we'll move on to face masks and this new instruction and implementation of social distancing and the wearing of face masks. What are your views on the breathing difficulties and complications with face masks?
Obviously, like anybody else, I went on the internet and I looked at all the information there, and what I can say is that there's such inconsistency. If I go to the literature which talks about masks, it's not going to. These paper masks have all the trials show that not really very effective, or not effective at all, because they allow things. The masks are designed for medical staff not to breathe mucus and bacteria and so forth onto a vulnerable patient. Okay, it's not really designed to stop something which is It floats in the air, you know, it's very, very light and very, very small. So how this mask is going to prevent that, I can't even imagine. And then you go to, say, countries like Taiwan, which have got 24 million people. It's not possible to do social distancing because the place is jam-packed. 12 deaths. 12 deaths. Taiwan, no social distancing. And then you go to, like, you know, you look at this, then you go for the proper use of a mask. So these trials where they showed, some trials showed them they believed they might be effective. Other trials said zero, useless. But then you go to the protocols on how to use a mask. You've got to sanitize your hands first. You mustn't touch the mask. You put the mask on, you mustn't touch it. If you touch it, that's the end of the mask. You cannot touch anything else and then touch the mask again. So you'd need 10 or 15 masks a day, and you'd have to have hand sanitizer with you at all times whenever you adjusted the mask. So this business of pulling the mask down, having a cigarette or eating, and then putting the mask back up again, this is dead in the water.
So the prolonged wearing of a face mask, can that actually affect the respiratory system and create more complications?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Because if you're used to, because your respiratory, because people can live in high altitudes, like the Mexico Olympics, the Olympians, the competitors had to go there weeks in advance to acclimatize themselves to different altitude where the oxygen is less, you see. But it takes a couple of weeks and they're extremely fit and they can adjust to it. But we are adjusted at sea level to an O2 level of around 20 or 21%. Fine. Now you put on this mask. And then, according to this chap who did some tests with the OSHA approved device, which detects levels of oxygen, the level of oxygen falls to 17.5%. That's the first point. So you'll have deficiency of oxygen. Second point, because it's enclosed, you're going to rebreathe your own carbon dioxide. Not dangerous necessarily, but it'll make you feel more breathless and enormously uncomfortable. And you will try to compensate by breathing more. And if you breathe more, then you'll discharge more CO2, and now you'll disturb things. It could make a person sick. What I would say, and certainly make them feel very, very uncomfortable. Possibly it may not bother small kids that much, but I think anyone older in middle age is going to find it very difficult to sustain themselves.
Yeah, we kind of seem divided in society, particularly here in Britain. Most people who are pro-mask believe that it stops the spread of the virus and from catching the virus at the same time. So the opinion within that group are that, you know, it's for the better of everyone and we're protecting ourselves and protecting other people at the same time. What's your view on that?
A good example to look at is Sweden, where they blew it. They didn't protect their elderly people, and the elderly people died like flies. And so the spike of the death rate in Sweden, and their death rate per million is quite high. But if you analyze the middle-aged people and the younger people and the children and so forth, their rates of not of transmission, but their rates of death are much better than many countries which have adopted these draconian, laws and so forth. There's no social distancing that I'm aware of, and you're not obliged to wear a mask. But then people will say, oh, the deaths per million. Yes, that's true. But Sweden blew it because they didn't protect the elderly. And the other difference with Sweden is that their COVID response is being run by an epidemiologist. And he's using epidemiological principles. The other thing that disturbs me is that the work of Linus Pauling on vitamin C, you got to know about it, pretty much incontrovertible findings, the reality of how much zinc can be helpful to people, And I would have thought that the government or any authority would say, right, how we respond to this remains to be seen, but at least initially we're going to encourage everyone, vitamin C, zinc, get in the sun. Viruses hate the sun. Get in the sun. Take lots of vitamin C, please. And the government is subsidizing the distribution of vitamin C to all food banks, or subsidizing it, or giving it out in schools, or whatever. This would be the way, because you'd want your immune system to be as strong as possible.
Very important point for people to increase their intake and supplements of those vitamins, and zinc also as precautionary measures, and to support the immune system.
Of course, and also to treat COVID patients the same way that you treat patients who have identical symptoms. Pneumonia. Okay, pneumonia is full of mucus and so forth. Okay, but generally the symptoms are inflammation of the bronchus and the lungs and so forth. COPD patients, treat them the same way. I mean, and now they're coming round to that. Now, as I said earlier, shouldn't really repeat myself, I guess, but now they're saying, breakthrough, budesonide in a nebulizer. Really? That's a normal treatment. If you've got asthma and you come down with a serious cold or infection, like a flu for a normal person is a flu. A flu for somebody who has asthma, it can mean, or COPD or emphysema, it can mean the end. So what do they do with those people? Put them in a comfortable place in bed, make sure they're sitting upright, not lying on their back. Hot fluids, lemon, vitamin C, and steroid and some antibiotic, and keep warm and keep comfortable, and that's about it. But what kills people is the cytokine storm, and that can be arrested with any kind of corticosteroid, providing you have enough. I think people will see the results, I would expect in most cases within a few hours. I would expect them to feel a little better within a few hours. So it doesn't, what I'm seeing, it doesn't make sense to me from what I've observed. Well,
it's great to hear your viewpoint, being an expert in the field of breathing. Just concluding this interview, could you advise viewers about how they can learn more about the Buteyko method?
Sure. We've got a website. It's www.learnbutekyo online. They can take a look at the website. We have a lot of scientific literature on there for the boffins who are into that sort of thing. Those who read biochemistry, they can see the extraordinary work of Kazimov. Those who just want more anecdotal stuff can look at the testimonials. We have webinars on they're free, so people can go online and come to one of our free meetings. No one's under any obligation to just come along, ask questions, learn about the idea. We run workshops regularly. Well, it depends on demand, once, twice, or thrice, or whatever times a week at various times, because we work for people all over the world. So, yeah, I mean, we're quite accessible in that way. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your expert information and advice with us today here on Surviving 2020. Been a pleasure speaking with you, Christopher.
It's been a delight speaking to you too as well, Daniel. Been really very, very enjoyable, and quite a privilege to be in the inaugural edition of Surviving 2020. I hope that I've given maybe some little help for people to indeed survive 2020.